Well, some parts of the Midwest saw pretty heavy rainfall here over the weekend. That could definitely help out some of those very dry soils and maybe help out some of the river levels as well. Here to talk about that and look at the forecast ahead, we welcome in Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions here for our weekly weather update. Eric, good to catch up with you again. And man, oh man, there were some areas of the Midwest that got some really hefty rainfall totals here over the weekend, Eric.
Yeah, and like you said, we needed it. There's so much of the upper Midwest, so much of the Mississippi basin and the Missouri basin and the Ohio basin that have been so dry. So when you look back over this weekend and see just soaking widespread rains, I mean, from Montana to Wisconsin, and then from Texas, eastern Texas, all the way up to Iowa, we're talking about some great moisture to get returned to this area. So it did beat back against a big area of drought. We saw soil moisture levels begin to climb. We're going to start to see that water get into the big river system. It's going to be a while before it gets down there closer to you, though. If you think about Memphis, it's going to take a few days for that water to percolate through. So that means we're still sitting about 9 feet below low stage at Memphis on the Mississippi River. But this is the right way to start things off to start to bring the rain in. Now, elsewhere on this map, two things to point out. There was also incredibly heavy rains from Tropical Storm Ophelia that went up the East Coast, really hit North Carolina pretty hard and Virginia. But remember, parts of North Carolina, Virginia, the Mid Atlantic had been in drought throughout this summer. And by the way, we're done with summer. Fall officially began on Saturday. Kind of a quick fun fact if you didn't know this, summer is actually our longest season.
Hmm.
I know we're taught as kids that seasons are all 3 months long, but that's not true. Summer is actually 94 days long. And the reason for that is because we're farthest from the sun in summer. We're tilted toward it, but we're farthest from it. And as a result, we tend to get a slower progression around the sun, and therefore we
Mhm.
have a couple extra days of summer. So, long story short, we're now into fall, and the pattern's beginning to go into what I call week on, week off. I
Mhm.
just think we got a pattern where we're going to see a big system coming in the northwest, so all the action will be there, and then that'll progress next week into the midsection of the country, and the west will get a break, and then it'll just go back and forth and back and forth. So, welcome to transition. But the good news
Yeah.
is we are not doing the same thing we did a year ago, which was to build drought. We're actually starting to see things that work against it, and that makes me happy.
With that week on, week off mentality, I would have to think that that's gonna open up some harvest windows, but also some of those windows may be, maybe somewhat short, just with depending on how much rainfall falls in certain areas, right, Eric?
Yeah, and I'd like to. I'm going to call some friends today in Iowa that got those really heavy rainfalls because I
Mhm.
was in Iowa last week and they were harvesting like mad, and so I'm curious how much of it soaked in. Because I
Yeah.
went to a soccer tournament this weekend and on a field that got 2.5 inches of rain, it was hard again by Sunday afternoon.
Wow.
So some of that water is able to get in and move quickly. And so it'll be interesting to see how far out this kind of knocked us in terms of keeping harvesting. But I will say this about the week on, week off pattern. We're mild right now. We're going to continue to see more mild air throughout the Midwest. But I do think we will get into our a mid month shot at some pretty cold air if everything pans out the way I currently think it will. Who knows if that's the case, but we get out there to mid month. I think there's a decent shot at a normal first frost for a lot of folks in the Midwest. But until then, we're going to finish September and start October on a pretty mild note.
So as that we kind of look at that week on, week off, and then that potential frost you mentioned later in the month is kind of that short term outlook. What's the longer
Yeah.
term outlook here for the fall, Eric?
Yeah, so every fall forecast, every winter forecast, you're going to see all of it for the next 7 months. Let's just paint a big brush for the next 7 months. Everything is dominated by El Nino. So you won't find a forecast model right now that doesn't give you a typical El Nino outlook. So what does that mean? That tends to mean we get colder shots at air mid October. Tends to mean that the just subtropical jet starts to feed in better moisture into the Midwest. Two things I don't think a lot of us would be too upset about. But it does mean as you get into winter, very wet south, a little bit drier in the Pacific Northwest. It means more mild days than cold days throughout much of the Midwest. But overall, winter could be shaping up to be pretty active, which in most cases, active winters tend to give us better chances at reducing drought, which we like to see as we go into spring. Now, just something to think about. If we are more mild throughout winter than average, now that doesn't mean you won't get shots at cold air. That's every winter. But I'll be anxious to watch how quickly the soils freeze up in the Midwest, upper Midwest, and plains, because if they take longer to freeze up and we get more moisture on top of them, that's moisture that gets in before the soil locks everything down. So I think that's going to be critical to watch for the next several months here. And I'd say keep an eye on Hawaii. Now, the reason why is in winter with El Nino, the jet stream loves to come from Hawaii to California to like the Arklatex region. And if that's the case, we tend to set up the Midwest with a lot of adverse weather, especially in your neck of the woods.
Well, thinking about that long range forecast, I know a lot of folks are also looking at what's going on in South America right now. How are they getting started with planting, et cetera? So, what's your current outlook for South America, Eric?
Yeah, so it's been very wet in southern Brazil, like flooding constantly in parts of southern Brazil, like Rio Grande do Sul. But we're still waiting on the monsoon to really get kicking in parts of central Brazil. So a lot of times, what we monitor this time of year is the planting progress out of Mato Grosso, their biggest producing state. That's responsible for about a third of all agriculture in Brazil, and especially corn and soybeans. And right now, this next week is going to be drier, but week two is more favorable. And remember, it is the month of October that better than 80% of that crop is planted in central Brazil. So, technically, according to the report that the IMEA released last week, Mato Grosso is just a hair above average on planting pace. But remember, we're still in the sub 2% category here on
Hmm.
planting pace. So, October is the month to watch. I do see better moisture coming through. There's going to be a lot of fighting in the markets over which model to use. Just remember this, okay? In a situation like we got right now, people that want to see a delay in the monsoon are going to use the GFS. People that are going to want to see fast planting are going to use the European model. European's wetter, GFS is drier. Reality probably lives somewhere in the middle. And at this point, I don't see any major events upsetting planting pace in Brazil as we go forward,
Hmm.
except for the flooding down south. So, yeah, that's what I think we're going to be watching.
I find that interesting. Perception is reality in some cases there. It's whatever you want to
Yeah.
believe. That's the model
Yeah.
you're going to use, right, Eric?
It is, and I mean, and there's good reasons for why those models are different. So the GFS has a known problem right now with getting soil temperatures right, getting the what we call the boundary layer temperatures right, and it's lower resolution, meaning that it doesn't capture convective events like storms very well. The European model doesn't have those problems. So I love our flagship model. I'm proud of what National Weather Service and the National Center for Environmental Prediction built. But I will use the superior forecasting model in this case, which I think the Europeans could have a better handle on it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. We'll tell you if
Mhm.
I'm wrong. But I think that's the case right now.
Anything else you're watching globally or here in the US the next couple of weeks ahead here, Eric?
You know, globally, Europe's going into a drier week, but we're talking about harvest, not a whole lot of complaint there. I saw very wet conditions continue to be forecast for India. Like they should be done with their monsoon, and it's still just wet. There's some heavy rains coming into the Yangtze River, which we always watch for fall flooding potential. And in Australia, like New South Wales, parts of Queensland, Victoria, that's the east, there are some indications that they're getting some much needed spring rain. Think about their winter wheat crop getting that rain to finish, and nearly all forecasts though were not predicting it. So I think we got to watch that carefully. And also, it's still have about 35 days left in the hurricane season,
Mhm.
so we could still get something to brew there. We only have Philippe right now, but Philippe is not expected to hit the United States. It's out in the middle of the Atlantic, so plenty to watch, but no major hurricanes coming our way.
Well, we do appreciate the insight. I know folks can sign up for your weekly weather newsletter and get the latest forecast details very easily online, ag-wx.com. That's ag-wx.com. And with that, Eric Snodgrass, Nutrient Ag Solutions, always good to talk with you. Have an awesome week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, you too.